I welcome Pauline Osse, who I think all of you know as the former director of the Wage Indicator Foundation, but of course now still part of our Living Wage team. And I would like to welcome Professor Christoph Scherer, who's the director of the International Center for Development and Decent Work, Anne Ziebart, who works at Better Work as a legal officer, and Jeff Wheeler from Elevate. And you have about 30 minutes for the panel. Good luck.
Thanks, Fiona, for the introduction already. And hi, Christoph, Anne, and Jeffrey. I don't see Jeffrey yet in the pin, but maybe he's down. And Jeffrey's there, I assume. Yes.
I am here.
And I would like to invite anyone else in the chat box also to ask questions, because you want to know whether this labor rights index is better than the one in 2020. Is it better than any other index in the world, etc. You want to know, and of course, I'm sure that the team in Pakistan wants to know it, because they worked day and night for it. First, you. So, Christopher, what do you think of this index?
Well, I'm very impressed by the work that has been done. And I imagine it is really a very tedious type of work to get through all these kind of legal texts there.
And was it good?
And yeah, I think it is very valuable, as we have the World Bank publishing Ease of Business Index, and there workers' protection, workers' rights are seen as an obstacle for development, but I think it is just the other way around there.
And that's a good one already.
And such an indicator can then also support then demands for better protection. We do also know from the business community, when they made CEOs' bonuses more transparent, that actually the bonuses went up, which we don't like. But as you make something more transparent, then of course people are more inclined to say, well, why don't I get the same? Why don't I get the better protection?
It's a tool for empowerment, finally.
Yes.
And Jeffrey, what do you think? You come from a churchly, so you don't come from the academic world, but from Elevate. Is it useful for you? Is it something new? What is your feeling about it, as far as you can see? Because we know all that you could only see it for 1.5 days.
So I'll just mention I wear multiple hats, and I'm speaking for myself too, but I also teach at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service. I have a class on trade and worker rights in the International Business Diplomacy program. And so first, my
hats. Yeah,
I multiple hats, yes, but speaking for myself. So congratulations for the Wage Indicator Foundation. I know this is only the second one, right? The second edition, but it's clear that this has been a decade or more worth of work here. Yeah. And so I think it's very important and very valuable. So those of us who are working in global supply chains, labor rights issues, are looking for more and more data sets that we can incorporate and use, because there's a whole set of new demands from regulators, from imports, from supply chains, workers, civil society. So there's a real demand for more and better data sets. So I think this is very helpful. It's very useful. And I think an interesting question will be following up is how do countries, civil society, stakeholders use the data and get something of a feedback loop about that? Will be very interesting to see. The other is how it's integrated with other approaches, other indices or data sets. I think one good thing about the index is that it identifies and explains its methodology, which has some strengths and some weaknesses and some limitations, but knowing in terms of transparency what's behind the data sets and what it's being used for. There's some trade-offs in having not binary, non-binary, focusing on formal sector labor laws. So I think it's all good, but being also very clear about what the subset of indicators are and how the scores are reached. So for me, when I look at these and other indicators, I'm looking for, are the rights protected in law? Are there appropriate remedies and penalties that are integrated into the law? And then whether there's appropriate institutional responsibility. And I don't know if it's played out here, but in some countries, there's a question about, we're in a common law system versus a civil law system or socialist market economy. So in a civil law system, you have a lot of the details in the code itself.
Yeah.
And in a common law system, not necessarily. It may be in court decisions as opposed to explicitly in the legislation. So that would just be kind of a question for me in terms of better understanding the methodology. But on the whole, it's a very useful tool. And I think it's also useful for measuring a country's progress against itself from a previous year.
Yeah.
And so thank you very much.
And Jeffrey, if you are in between, can you think about the question and answer ready in the chat? Because then we get in the same time question and answers from others as well. And usually we start with the ladies, but I would like to start, end the first round with you. What is your feeling about Let's Do the Job? Of course, we know that it was a hell of a lot of work, but was it good?
Yeah, I was going to comment on the amount of work that must have been involved to put this together. I mean, it's enormously impressive. 135 questions, 46 specific indicators, and then tying back to the actual underlying legislation for all of that is incredible. And I did the math. That's 6,210 determinations on these indicators. So it's just super impressive in terms of the amount of work that must have gone into it. And I mean, I think it's quite interesting. The ILO, of course, is not in the business of ranking countries against each other. So we just look at each country sort of on its own. And I don't know, for people that may not be familiar with the Better Work program, which is where I am situated in the ILO, our focus is on garment supply chains and trying to improve the working conditions in garment factories in developing countries. And we do go in and assess working conditions against national legislation and against the ILO fundamental conventions on the fundamental rights at work. So there's a definite legal component to the work that we're doing. One thing that was interesting for me was to see sort of good news and bad news, I guess. So I noticed Bangladesh is in that list of worst performers. And that is one of the countries where we have a program presently. To be honest, there have been some improvements in Bangladesh over the years that we've been present in the country, but obviously there's still quite a room for improvement in Bangladesh. And then I also was happy to see Vietnam. Not surprised, because really Vietnam has made a lot of leaps forward, I would say, in recent years in its legislation. So a lot of improvements on the discrimination side, and I don't know if people are aware, they've recently ratified Convention 98. So they're really moving forward at a great pace, which is great. One thing that I found interesting was the COVID measures that were included in the country profile. I think that information could be used in a similar way to the other information that ties back to the 46 indicators for advocates and policymakers to identify areas where there were gaps in really addressing the crisis, and perhaps then look to legislation that has been used by other countries that didn't have those gaps. So I thought that was interesting. I was happy to see that for almost every single one of those 46 indicators, there is a tie back to an ILO convention.
Thank God.
That's
beautiful.
Yeah, that made me happy. And even for the ones that didn't tie back directly to a convention or a recommendation, they did actually tie back to another ILO document. So the M&E Declaration was one of them that was mentioned, and the decisions of the Committee on Freedom of Association. So that, I think that's great. Obviously, you want the thing to be well-grounded. There were a couple areas where I thought the indicators could be tweaked in the future. I think the trade union freedoms, particularly in the area of anti-union discrimination, could be expanded. It's currently only focusing on protection against termination in the context of a strike. And obviously there is a whole range of anti-union discrimination that can take place that is not happening always in the context of a strike. And I noticed just now that under maternity at work, there's an indicator on asking about pregnancy status during recruitment. And from the ILO's perspective, that's actually really firmly coming under discrimination. So there might be some, a couple comments on that. But I think in general, when you look at the heat map, you're not too surprised, to be honest. That,
I mean, then it feels good, then it feels okay.
It seems to make sense.
Yeah. And then can you say that all the work ILO has been doing, that this heat map gives a good picture of what the ILO has been doing over the years?
Well, I don't know if I can make that statement or not right now without really going into the details.
Because it's one picture, basically. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. But, we see, okay, Europe, it's generally scoring pretty high. And I think probably some of the reason for that is Europe is doing well on some of the more challenging areas that were mentioned, like family responsibilities, obviously trade union freedoms. You see developed countries and middle income countries generally doing, reasonably well.
Yeah.
And then, of course, lesser developed countries and low-income countries, having more challenges. So in general, it just at a sort of a glance at the heat map, it seems to make sense. And I think in a way, then it's a reflection of the fact that, yeah, there is some sense to these indicators.
Can I ask a question back and then? Well, it might be the most logic to ask it to the lady, but maybe Christopher or Jeffrey jump in as well. If you look at the index now, that it feels like at least the position or the rights for women are a bit better than 2 years ago. At least it feels like minimum wages in a set of countries have been improving. And I learned over the years that minimum wage at least good for women. Can we state that this year that in this index the position of women has been improved? Yes or no? Is that also your feeling?
Was that directed to me specifically?
Well, you all can jump in. Is it true or you don't think it's true?
Well, I see there are two movements. The one movement is that norms are spreading a bit and are incorporated in law. And so the norm of gender equality spreads around the world. And then there is a movement of squeezing labor, and squeezing labor has always something to do with making use of the divisions and enforcing the divisions between ethnic groups, between men and women, and so on. And here I do see quite a number of countries now really putting a lot of pressure and making work more precarious, and those who are more vulnerable are usually then also women. So I see this kind of a double movement.
Yeah, but that you don't see it reflected in the rights because it's still allowed.
Yes. Yeah.
That's then.
Well, that if I'm allowed to perhaps move on to this question of what could be perhaps improved, I believe very, very important is the degree of informality, It's quite right that the index is focusing on the formal sector, but it should also highlight the amount of the. But here, of course, it has to be careful that we don't put agriculture in it. So it should be the non-agricultural sector and the informality degree we have there. And then I think really
Christopher, just one sec. Let me ask whether Iftikhar in the chat box still can answer all questions which come from you, from Anne, from Jeffrey, because then we have different lines of information for all of us. So Iftikhar and team, can you do that in the chat box? So yes. That's to start with. And do you have more to improve, Christoph? And then to Jeffrey.
I think, of course, the implementation, that is very difficult to monitor and so on. But there are certain indexes concerning the access to courts. I think that's also very important, you know. You may have the wonderful law, but you don't really have an access to court. And I'm a little bit puzzled about the index where Germany is just a little bit ahead of Russia, and the US is far below Russia. And I think that's not quite right. We have seen a lot of independent trade unionists being purged in Russia and having major problems and so on. And that perhaps leads to this question concerning weighing, whether certain rights need more weight in relationship to others.
To have an extra double check on the US or on Russia needs to be done because it's one big green lap in the heat map at the moment. Maybe too much green at the moment. Then let me go quickly back to Jeffrey. First, back on the question. Is this index already showing that the position for women is better, or you don't have the feeling at all?
So my question or caution would be, so I think it's a useful set of data points, but you have to understand them in context. So are men and women being treated equally bad in certain sectors? You know, so kind of the breakdown by industry, like ethnic groups. So there's an issue there, right? So that's one indicator, is the difference between treatment of men and women. But the other caution for context is, speaking of Bangladesh, there was a big push to increase minimum wage about 10 years ago, and it was highly acclaimed. There were two problems with that. One is in the garment industry, they flattened the wage rates. So they reduced the wages of people the higher levels to compensate for the increases in minimum wage. So if you look at average wages or a living wage, it had not improved, right? The minimum wage had improved. And the other problem with prosperity was this kind of gap in power, which was landlords raised the rents on particularly the women working in the garment sector. So the minimum wage went up, but prosperity as a measure went down. So I think a very telling indicator here is that the worst performance is on trade union rights, which correlates with this growing gap in wealth as well. For me, the heat map had some glaring questions. My impression was very different from impression was different from Anne's. With Christophe, it raised it too. So I don't know, Russia's green, really? And even Ukraine, you know, as I understand it, they're waiving the application of labor laws. This may be, okay, so it's war and whatnot, but this is an issue in a number of these countries, and it even happened in Pakistan some years ago, which was, there are labor laws on the book, but there's kind of a formal waiver of the application of the labor law, maybe in the export processing zones. So that may just be sort of more of an issue of timing of why Russia and the Ukraine are green. But again, I'd say I look at these kind of data sets in context of other sources of information. Political freedom is an issue as well, other measurements of prosperity. And I would mention too, on the supply chain side, groups like Elevate and others have really sophisticated data sets based on audits, worker surveys, and Sentinel surveys, which is gathering information about data sources, about compliance with a deeper set of indicators. So this is useful in the context of other data sets that I look at.
Then it might be a good idea to combine these data sets one day and to analyze and be smarter for the next index.
It's definitely an ongoing process, improving the data sets, moving towards collaboration.
Next question about informality, because now, of course, this whole index has been focusing on formal labor or formal labor market, because it's it's the first step, or it's easier, you might say. Is it anyway possible to do this for an informal sector? I can ask it to Iftika, but also to you, because you're also in the know of this. Is it anyway possible?
One question I'll raise is, how do you define informal sector, right? Because we don't have a common definition for that. So that's an issue. It's fun. Yeah. Can we reach some consensus on a definition of the informal sector? Might be a starting point.
I would say informal sector is at least anyone who we now all see as informal, which could be the domestic workers, those who work in platforms, those who work self-employed. Obviously, they still have regulations, but they're more informal than people with who work under a collective agreement. Let's start with these. So not with the illegals yet. But with the domestic workers, for instance, the platform workers, could they be part of such an index next time? Is it possible to do that? Jeffrey, Anne, Christopher?
I don't know if it's possible. God bless you if you can do it. I certainly would be interested in the data sets. Again, if you can kind of move towards at least a commonly applicable definition and then collect data related to it, I think you can for some data sets. Others will be very hard to get.
Mm-hmm. And Anne or Christopher?
Well, I would say that the informal sector comes with a lot of different shades, and this has to be recognized. I don't think it is easy to really measure that, but what one could, in a way, point out the degree of it, and then one has a better feeling of the labor relations in a country for that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in India, the formal sector has really shrunk that, and then we have the problem that even in the formal sector, there is a lot of informality coming in, because then a lot of workers are hired then as gang labor and no longer really as employee of that company, even though it's a manufacturing company. That. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think really the key message is here the labor rights indicator is a wonderful tool to see how governments are implementing laws, not implementing, putting laws onto the books, that, and coming along with their commitments they have given, whether their commitments within the ILO, the United Nations and so on, and whether they put that into their national law. And then one also needs further indicators, frequently also more on a qualitative basis of what is actually going on in the country.
Yeah, so the real compliance, that's really, that's it. That's the next step, or it's another world. Then to make that realistic to do that. So, Christopher, if I look at this index, how would you use it? How would you use it in your work, or would you not use it at all for your students, for instance?
No, I think one can, of course, use it there in order to show the differences. One can also try to see changes over time, and now we have already 2 time data points that is helpful. And then start also thinking about what is driving it. And students should think about how to explain changes.
Mm-hmm. So that would be your first question next week to your students. If you look at this, how does it come? And then obviously for Russia, Ukraine, they will say, but the index started measuring from 1st of January 2022, and then the war didn't start it yet.
Anyway, well, there's one little correction I have to make in my introduction is that since 1 week I'm retired there. But we will have an alumni meeting with our Asian alumni rather soon, and we'll certainly then also discuss the labor rights indicator.
Cool, thanks a lot. Then how you will use it, Anne? How will you use the labor rights index, if you want to use it?
First of all, let me just say, I'm not saying that heat map was 100% spot on for every single country. And I was also quite surprised at the big green area known as Russia. So there were a few things on the map that I was like, that's surprising me. But still, just to see Western Europe was generally blue and green. I mean, I think it's taking a step back and the big picture, okay, and maybe you block out Russia and a couple other countries as well. There were definitely a few surprises in there, but I think, overall, it did seem to make sense. How would I foresee using it? So we, at Better Work, we have pretty good familiarity with the laws in the countries where we have programs. We're currently in 12 countries, including, as I mentioned, Bangladesh. We're also in Vietnam, as I mentioned. And what I could see doing, though, is before we go into a new country, we do a feasibility study and we look at a whole range of criteria, including the legal landscape in the country that we're contemplating starting a program in. And this is the kind of thing that would help us just get like a snapshot view of where things stand on, on these specific indicators. I mean, I think it's interesting and can be useful at the same time that there are obviously limitations on it. It's 46, which seems like a ton of work, but it's also, that's a pretty narrow look. And I think another one of the issues that is even sort of underlying a lot of the comments that are being made, for example, also with Russia, I'm surprised that their laws are as good as they seem to be, but is this the difference, between having laws on the books and then actually doing implementation. And I think, back to your question about, is it better for women now? I think that you can't just stop with the laws because that doesn't matter if you're a woman working in a garment factory. The fact that the law's on the books, if it's not being adhered to, it makes absolutely
you're not a tough fighter, you will never get it. Yes.
Yeah. But I could see that for us, it could be just sort of a useful snapshot for countries that we do not have a presence in, less, more so than the ones where we are currently working.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And so Jeffrey, how will you use it? How will you use this knowledge? Talking to Iftikhar, of course, about issues in different countries. I'm sure you will do that behind the screens. But how would you use it?
Iftikhar is a great resource on Pakistan. We're implementing a pilot in the cotton sector in Pakistan, so that's great. So I guess two ways. One is, I have a group of students and I can make some assignments, and we're addressing this, the kind of the data sources for labor rights. It will be a point of discussion among my students. The other is I'm sharing it with people within Elevate who are the real data experts, the people that go really deep on indices. And I'll share it with them and get some feedback. It's also a tool for them to look at and to consider. So share it with colleagues who are working on supply chains, and then also with students and engage them on a discussion about it.
Cool. Then looks like that this discussion as we have now, 2 years ago, we had a discussion as well on why is the informal sector not there? Why is there nothing about compliance? And we realized that it's very difficult. It might be an idea not to wait another 2 years for a new indicator, but to have next year already, that's a quick snapshot where we could improve, where we could change. Is Ukraine or Russia then still on the same level, or do we need to change? Or do we have already ideas how to let's say, to get better ideas about how to get the informal sector involved? Maybe that's an idea. And I hope Iftikhar behind the screen I can't see you anymore at the moment, but that he agrees with his team. And I'm sure Wage Indicator will agree with that then we continue. For all you students, which you will meet the coming weeks, if they have done, let's say, small assignments, small reports on it, please share them with us. We would love that. We will do the same, by the way, with our 150 interns. Ask them to crack the index, and to, by that, not to make it worse, but make it better, of course. And in general, if you come to conclusion, then it was hard work. Not easy, it is useful, and obviously it can be improved all the time, but then we are among legal people who never will be finally satisfied. I think it should always be better, but I think that's right. Thanks for now, and I'm sure you will be there next time, including Christoph, I'm sure. Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks, Anne, for your contribution. We continue now with Beryl, isn't it?
Yes. Thank you.